Hi everyone, Happy New Year and welcome back to Aspergers from the Inside. So how many of you know what it's like to overcompensate? So you might not be particularly skilled at something, or you might be a little bit nervous about performing and just put in way too much effort and end up smashing it out of the park. An example of this for me is I walked the Camino de Santiago a couple of years ago, quite a few years ago actually now. And the very first day, I got up at 5 a.m. and I leveraged the jet lag because I was already awake, and I just started walking, and I had to cross the Pyrenees in one day. It was like 27 kilometers over the hills. And I did it in about 6 hours. It was absolutely ridiculous. I took hardly any breaks. I walked super fast, and I got there so early that none of the accommodation was even open. I paid for it the next day. Part of the process for me was learning how to slow down, learning that my natural pace is enough and I don't always need to push myself. But that little bit of extra not being confident in the beginning led me to overcompensate and actually, smash it and do a really, really good job. So today I'm going to share a couple of tips because I think learning how to overcompensate in a good way can be really helpful to us on the spectrum. I'll share an example from my life, and then at the end I'm going to tell you about a free webinar that I'm running. So stick around for that if you'd like to learn more about some of the tips that I'm talking about in this video. So the reason that my theory on the reason that a lot of us overcompensate is because a big part of being on the spectrum is having gaps in our skill set, and I've talked about this in other videos. And what I mean by gaps is that you might be good at some things, naturally good at some things, and then horrendously naturally poor at other things. So the things that I'm not naturally good at, I'm going to find workarounds so that I don't have to do that exact thing. And I'm going to utilize my strengths so that I don't have to do the things that don't come naturally to me. So with that in mind, think about what's your superpower? What's something that you do better than almost everyone else? And how are you currently using that to overcome the other challenges that might be more difficult for you? Something I realized recently is that every strength is a weakness, and vice versa. Every weakness is a strength. I'll give you an example. I'll frame it as the weakness first, right? So for me, I need things to be really structured, really clear, and have really clear. I almost need to draw a flow chart of how something works before I can understand how it works. It needs to be really structured in my mind, otherwise it's just too complicated and I don't get it. So the strength of that is that I do that all the time. I gather really complex information and I simplify it to a degree, and I structure it to a degree that I could draw you a flow chart of how it works. This happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this is connected to this. And that gives me amazing summarizing and explaining skills, because this is what I do 24 hours a day, is take complex information that doesn't make sense to me and simplify it and structure it and order it so that it is really simple and easily understandable for me. And that helps. That's like my superpower of summarizing and explaining, because if I can do that for me, if I then share my explanation with someone else, you may have noticed this with some of my other videos, then it makes complicated things easy to understand. But on the other hand, if I can't do that, I just don't understand, and I really need to make it really simple and straightforward, otherwise I just don't get it. So a good example of how I did this is emotional intelligence, my special interest. So as I was growing up, some of you may have heard a little bit about my story. I found figuring out why other people did what they did and the just neurotypical behavior in general to be really confusing. And I would always ask, what are the rules? How does this work? I just don't get it. And didn't fare socially very well in that respect. So what did I do? I used my superpower of being able to take this really complicated information and find the rules behind it to essentially crack the neurotypical code and figure out what is it that makes how can I understand this really complicated behavior in a really simple way? And it turned out that the answer was that we were communicating on different frequencies. The neurotypical population is a lot more, in my experience, a lot more emotional in general than those of us on the spectrum. And instead, we tend to be more literal, more cognitive, more wanting to know the reasons behind things, wanting to know things, know the order, wanting to understand exactly how things work. Whereas the neurotypicals tend to, in general, just go in and use their instincts and follow their emotions, especially as children. So to answer questions like, how do you make friends? Well, they don't know because they just go in and just do what comes naturally and it just happens. And it turns out that if you want to understand their behavior, you have to understand emotions. So I used my superpower of summarizing and understanding complex information to study essentially emotions until it made really good sense. And what they call this nowadays is emotional intelligence. Ever since Daniel Goleman termed this word in 1995, we've had a term to describe what it means to understand how emotions work, but not only at an intellectual level, but actually at a practical level of using that information to monitor your own emotions and regulate the emotional interactions that you have with other people. Essentially, if you want to understand human behavior, you have to understand human emotion. And so that's why I've been so interested in this topic, because I really wanted to understand people around me so that I could get along in the world and so that I could communicate better with people, form relationships. Common questions are, how do I behave in a job interview? How do I get a girlfriend? How do I save a relationship? All these kind of things. The answer is that you need to understand how the emotions work, because emotions drive behavior. Anyway, so as you know, that's my special interest. And what I'm doing is I've put together an emotional intelligence course and to share my special interest with you as well, so that you don't need to learn by trial and error. You can learn my summarized version that I've already prepared for you that makes sense step by step. I do have a flowchart in there of how emotions work, believe it or not. So I'm running a free webinar twice this year and potentially more often later on. So if you're watching this video after the initial date, check the website at emotionsexplained.com.au to see when the next free webinar will be on how to learn emotional intelligence. Because once we understand what emotional intelligence is, it becomes possible to realize that a lot of the questions we're asking, like how do I behave in a job interview? How do I stop people being annoyed at me? How do I manage frustration? How do I manage depression or anxiety? All of these things boil down to an emotional bedrock of if you understand how your own emotions work, it makes everything else a lot easier. There's one coming up on the 12th of January and the 12th of July in 2020. So please come along to that. It's completely free. And also, there'll be a 4-week emotional intelligence course also starting on that date. And there'll be information and I'll be sharing the 4 steps to mastering your emotional intelligence. So please check out emotionsexplained.com.au if you're interested in that. And I would really love to share my overcompensating strategies with you, which is essentially to dive in really deep cognitively, because I was always much better here than I was here. And I've used this to crack the emotional code. And I'd really love to share that with you if you're interested, of course. So check out emotionsexplained.com.au. And next week, I'll be sharing the 4 steps to mastering emotional intelligence. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Okay, thanks. Bye.